Chapter 21. Liberating the Village. "Sounds like fun," Gaggara commented eagerly. She rubbed her hands together. "What?" Oss asked. "Just the three of us?" "Just Gaggara and I," Reyes told him. "Thanks to our wings, we have a better chance of getting close to the guards before they notice us." "Oh." Orsa sounded a little disappointed. "Besides," Reyes said, "if anything does go wrong, it would be nice to have someone here protecting the prisoners." Orsa glanced round at the cells. His hands tightened on the huge axe he was carrying, and he nodded. "I suppose you're right." Reyes looked at Gaggara. "I saw how the guards are set up while we were waiting for Chargeman Vert to return to the village with his patrol. They seem to be arranged more of an eye to keeping the villagers inside the village, rather than giving any real thought to any possible attack from outside." Gaggara interrupted him. "Are you going to work your magic so I can actually see where I'm going and what I'm doing?" "Oh, of course," Reyes replied. He touched her gently on the side of the head. She seemed to enjoy his touch, moving her head a little so that his hand rubbed against her gently, effectively petting her. "Keep still," he whispered. "Sorry," she replied. She looked deep into his eyes and smiled. Reyes set about casting the cat's-eye spell on her. It was a fairly easy spell to cast and only took a few seconds to do. Having cast the spell, Reyes let his hand drop to Gaggara's shoulder where he stroked her gently. "Is that it?" Gaggara asked. "That's it," Reyes acknowledged. "I don't feel any different," Gaggara said. "Really?" Reyes was a little surprised. "There should be a bit more glare off the lanterns. It'll be more noticeable when you get outside." "Oh, right," Gaggara agreed, beginning to head to the door. "Hold on," Reyes called after her. "Don't go anywhere yet. I'm not quite ready." Gaggara stood by the door and turned to face her boyfriend, watching him expectantly. "Don't be too long, I want to get started." Before he ventured out into the dark of the night, Reyes wanted first to make sure his own cat's-eye spell was still active. He had lost all track of time since he had first cast the spell, and it wasn't an exact science as to how long each fresh casting would last anyway. It was better for him to recast the spell now, rather than have it suddenly give out on him at a vital moment. Once again, the casting of the spell took only a few seconds. Creeley, the soldier, moved to the other side of Galiki and continued to watch what Reyes and company were doing through the bars of the cell. He seemed quite concerned as to what Reyes and indeed the other harpy were doing. Finally, it seemed he could contain his curiosity no longer. "What's going on?" Reyes turned his head and he did his best to give the soldier a reassuring smile. "We're going to try and liberate the village for you." "Great," the soldier commented. "How about letting us out of these cells? The key must be around here somewhere. Maybe the guard had it." Reyes shook his head. "There were soldiers patrolling the street and nothing covering the windows. Should one of them see that you are loose, we're finished. It could prove disastrous. We're going to leave Orsa here." He tapped Orsa lightly on the shoulder to indicate him behind to watch over and protect you. Creeley looked at the Minotaur and nodded doubtfully as he half-heartedly said, "Oh, great." Orsa looked around at Reyes and gave him a querying look. Reyes patted Orsa amicably on the shoulder and said, "It's all right, my friend." Then he said to Gaggara, "Once we step out of this building, I want you to fly to the right end of the street. Go behind the houses to avoid being seen. There, take out the guard at the end of the village, and when you get the chance, deal with the patrol. Once you have finished, I'll meet you on the back of the roof of that large domed building." "Got it," Gaggara said, eagerly reaching for the door handle. "Hold on," Reyes warned. Gaggara stopped with her hand on the handle of the door. She let go of it and looked round quizzically at her boyfriend. Reyes made his way to one of the small square barred windows and looked out. It was dark out there, but with his eyesight enhanced thanks to his cat's-eye spell, he was able to see the two guards on duty outside the municipal building. The two roving patrols were about to pass each other right in front of the municipal building. "Not yet," he said without looking round. "What is it?" Gaggara asked. "I'll say when," Reyes replied. Reyes waited. The patrols passed each other, the lanterns they were carrying supplying only a modicum of light for them to see by. There was an almost imperceptible greeting between the two patrols, a slight twitch of a hand, and an awkward smile. Then they had passed, and were slowly increasing the gap between them as they headed in opposite directions towards the two extremities of the village. Reyes continued to watch. He estimated that at their current pace it would take the patrol no more than about 3 minutes to reach the end of the street and the guards stationed there. About a minute after the guards had passed each other, Reyes stepped away from the window. "Okay, now?" Gaggara asked. "Let's go," Reyes agreed. Gaggara opened the door and stepped out into the darkness of the night. Reyes had to hurry round the desk as quickly as he could. But he was virtually right behind her. Nevertheless, as he stepped out into the night, she was already gone. Reyes looked up in time to see Gaggara's tail disappear over the top of the custodian's house. He was worried about her. She was a harpy, a natural hunter, and more than capable of handling herself. But it was still possible that something could go wrong. If Orsa had had wings, he would have probably preferred to ask Gaggara to stay and guard the prisoners. Then again, he had already kept her out of the big battle earlier that morning. She might never forgive him if he tried to hold her back from every little skirmish. Before he too took to the air, Reyes glanced quickly round at Orsa as he wanted to be reassured that the Minotaur would be alright on his own. Orsa gave him an approving nod. Reyes smiled and nodded back, and then he closed the door behind him. Suddenly he felt alone. There was a cool breeze in the air that he hadn't noticed before. He couldn't help glancing towards the two guards on duty outside the municipal building, and wondering just how suspicious he must look to them. He hoped they hadn't seen him at all, yet the building they were guarding seemed so close to the custodian's house, and Reyes could see them so clearly that he couldn't see how they could miss him. Reyes tried not to worry about it. Even if the guards had seen him, they were supposed to be allies. Surely they couldn't look into his mind and see his intent. Besides, if he didn't get a move on, Gaggara would finish with her side of the street, then be waiting for him on the municipal building long before he was done. Perhaps she would get tired of waiting and take matters into her own hands. The custodian's building was all on one floor. It was quite a low building. Once Reyes was in the air, it was easy for him to glide gracefully over it. Then he flew to the left side of the street, using the village's houses to hide his presence from the roving patrol as he passed it. The very last house in the village, at least from Reyes' point of view, was a small, one-storey, ramshackle type of place. It looked as if the very wood was rotting. The roof was at a slightly off-kilter angle, and there were holes in the walls where some of the planks used to build the shack had broken. The building had also been patched in places, but no attempt had been made to repair the last few holes. Reyes landed softly behind the ramshackle building. He crept as quietly as he could to the edge and peered round at the lone guard. As Reyes had expected, the guard was looking inwards. He was armed with a sword that he kept in a scabbard at his waist, a shield that he carried on his arm, and a lantern that helped illuminate his immediate surroundings. As Reyes watched, the guard yawned. He was clearly tired and probably longing for his bed. Reyes could well imagine that the guard had been posted here before nightfall and would remain out here until daylight returned to the village. It was the lantern that bothered Reyes most. If he attacked the guard while the roving patrol was approaching, then it was more than likely they were going to see the attack. Reyes could picture them running as fast as they could from him, screaming that they were under attack. No, it was better to wait for the patrol to reach their turnaround point and then start to head back. Better to wait until the patrol had their backs to the guard before he struck. It wasn't a long wait. The roving patrol marched into view. They reached the guard and exchanged a few pleasantries, and the patrol turned round and began to march back in the opposite direction. Reyes kept his eye on the patrol. He moved from one edge of the ramshackle building to the other, making as little noise as he could. Then he watched the patrol through the gap between the houses as it marched past. Once the patrol had gone, Reyes moved back to the first edge of the building. Now was the best time to strike, before the patrol got too far away. Reyes peered back around the edge of the building at his first intended target. For a moment he felt sorry for the guard. The elf was doing no more than his duty. He just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And this was war. Reyes tried to shake the feeling from his mind. Gaggara would have no such qualms about killing. She enjoyed it too much. Perhaps she was right. He had a job to do. Reyes took a few steps back from the edge of the house in order to give his wings room to fully unfurl, and then he took to the air. He flew as quickly as he could, hoping the advantage of surprise would be on his side. At this speed, the flapping of his wings made a loud whooshing sound, but Reyes was so close to his intended victim that he was sure the guard wouldn't realise his danger before it was too late. Reyes was right. He was virtually on top of the guard before the guard had even become aware of the potential threat. Sword in hand, Reyes flew into the guard, pushing him bodily to the ground. He then thrust his sword through the chainmail armour that the guard was wearing. The guard let out a surprised cry, and then lay silent. One down, Reyes thought to himself. He needed to move quickly now, get to the patrol before they got much closer to the municipal building. Besides, Reyes felt a little uncomfortable about sitting in the puddle of luminescence coming off of the guard's lantern. Reyes set the lantern up straight, retrieved his sword from the guard, and was back in the air again within seconds. Reyes hit the patrol like a guided missile. He struck the guard on the left hard and heavy from behind with his talons, That was enough to unbalance the elf and cause him to fall to the floor. As Reyes rode the elf down, he lashed out with the full strength of his sword arm and deftly severed the other elf's head from his shoulders. It was then a simple matter for Reyes to reverse his sword and plunge it down into the back of the surviving elf. That was it. It was that easy. Reyes climbed back to his feet and listened. There was no cry of alarm, no approach of heavy footsteps coming to deal with the rogue harpy. He had killed his 3 targets and gotten away with it. Now it was time to fly to the back of the municipal building and meet up with Gaggara. One thing Reyes noticed as he took to the air again was that he was no longer shaking like a leaf every time he got into a fight. It was as if his body was beginning to get used to the danger and the sudden surge of adrenaline. This was the 4th time he had engaged in combat since the day began. Gaggara was already waiting for him when he reached the meeting spot. Even in the darkness he could see the red tint of blood on her claws, and it disturbed him the way she seemed to be sucking on her fingers, tasting that blood. "What kept you?" Gaggara teased. "Shh," Reyes replied. He put a finger to his mouth to show that he wanted her to be quiet, and then used that same finger to point down to the front of the building and slightly downwards, trying to indicate the 2 guards on duty at the doors. He knew it would be best if they could organise some sort of synchronised attack so that each of them would only have to handle 1 guard. Gaggara nodded, but evidently she didn't understand what Reyes really intended. She left her perch, flying down and round to the front of the municipal building. Reyes watched her go, his annoyance tinged with worry that she might get hurt. Then he too left his perch, following her as best as he could to the front of the building. By the time Reyes caught up with her, Gaggara had already killed one of the guards. He was lying in a pool of his own blood, and she was in the process of finishing off the 2nd guard, using her claws to punch a hole in the chain covering his stomach. "I guess you don't need me," Reyes commented as he landed at the top of the steps. Gaggara let the 2nd of the 2 guards fall to the floor. Then she licked the blood off her index finger before saying, "Don't be silly." Then she reached across and kissed him. "Without you, my daughter wouldn't exist." Reyes smiled, more being kissed than the sentiment. Then he opened the door to the municipal building and entered. It was nice of Chargeman Vert to show them where the commanding officer of the occupying forces in this village had set up his office. Reyes and Gaggara walked side by side along the short corridor to the door of the old mayor's office. Reyes opened the door, and they entered the room together. The elven drake man was sat behind his desk much as he had been before. His back was against the wall. His chair balanced on 2 legs while his legs rested on top of the empty desk. He was snoring. Chargeman Vert was sat behind the other desk. He was working on his report for the Emperor's man. "Tanrag!" The chargeman stood up alarmed. "Why have you come here? Did you need something?" "What is that sword doing in your—" Reyes lashed out with his sword, impaling the chargeman through the chest. The chargeman let out a yelp and fell to the ground in a noisy heap. The noise prompted the drake man to wake up and open his eyes. What is it?" He looked at Reyes. It was obvious he wasn't too sure what was happening. "Oh, it's you again. Why don't you just go? Go and camp out in the forest or whatever it is you creatures do. Don't you understand? I don't want you here." "Don't worry," Reyes told him. "We're leaving." "Good," the drake man replied. He closed his eyes again and settled back to sleep. "She's all yours," Reyes offered to Gaggara. "She's not going to be the most satisfying kill," Gaggara replied. "Well," Reyes said, shifting the weight of the sword in his hand just slightly, "if you don't want her—" "Look, you two," the elf muttered. "Please shut up. I'm trying to sleep here." "Oh, I want her," Gaggara replied. Gaggara jumped up on the empty desk. The elf opened his eyes, more in anger than alarm. Then Gaggara thrust her leg at the drake man, aiming for the elf's neck. She began to squeeze. Gently at first, but slowly her grip got tighter and tighter. It seemed she wanted to make this one last. The drake man, his legs still on the table, did the only thing still open to him. He lashed out with his foot. He couldn't put a lot of power into the kick, nor did he have much leverage to aim the blow properly. He kicked her just below her tail. "Ow!" Gaggara complained. She released her grip on the drakeman's throat and then leaped from the desk onto the chair that was holding the officer, forcing the chair to balance back onto all fours. She no longer seemed quite so keen in taking her time. Instead, Gaggara tore his throat out. "Are you all right?" Reyes asked. As concerned as he was, he couldn't stop smirking. "She kicked me in my—" Gaggara started. "I know," Reyes interjected. "Come on, let's get back to the custodian's house." "What? Already?" Gaggara sounded a little disappointed. "There are still elves in the village. We ought to finish them." Yes, Race agreed. By my calculation, there are probably around 25 more elves in the village. I expect they're staying as unwelcome guests with some of the peasants. I'm not sure we'd get much cooperation from the locals if we start going house to house looking for them. I feel it's a task better left to the villagers themselves. We could just cut down any villager that gets in our way, Gaggara suggested. Race gave Gaggara a funny look, uncertain whether she was being serious or not. Then he said, "Come on." Somehow the village seemed so much more peaceful now the streets had been cleared of elves. Race walked at a casual pace across the street to the custodian's house. Gaggara had no time for walking. She flew across the street and waited by the doors of the custodian's house for Race to catch up with her. When he did, they entered the building together. "How did it go?" Orsa asked as they entered the building. "How did it go?" Creeley asked from the cells. Race smiled at Orsa and nodded. "We've dealt with the guards and the 2 officers." Orsa smiled. His entire body seemed to have been on edge, and at the receipt of the news he relaxed considerably. He walked over to the desk and sat down on top of it, casually placing his axe across his knees. "So, what's next?" "Next is up to the villagers," Race replied. "Race," the soldier called. "Oh," the Minotaur commented uncertainly. Race walked over to the cell. He looked first at Creeley, and then he turned his attention to the lock. "What happened?" Creeley asked. "All the guards are dead. The only elves left in the village are the ones asleep in the houses," Race told him. "So we could escape," Galiki suggested hopefully. Race glanced up at the middle-aged man. "We could?" "Well then," Galiki pressed, "open the door, you foul-diferous monstrosity. Let us out." "What about the others?" Race asked. "Others?" Galiki seemed a little puzzled. "You 11 aren't the only prisoners in this village, you know," Race said firmly. "Wouldn't it be nice to take everyone with us?" "Well, yes, of course," Galiki replied defensively. Race shrugged. He twisted his hand quickly and in doing so unlocked the door. Then he moved to the second of the cell doors and repeated the motion. "Magic?" Galiki commented. "Yes," Creeley said. He tried the door tentatively at first, and when he found no resistance, he pushed it wide open and stepped out into the room. "I thought harpies couldn't use magic," Galiki commented. He followed the soldier through the cell door. "And," the soldier pointed out, "your granddaughter thought all harpies were girls." "True enough," Galiki admitted. Although Creeley and Galiki had been more than happy to step out of the cell, none of the others seemed at all keen on the idea of even approaching the bars, let alone leaving their cells. Not one of them wanted to venture any closer to the 2 harpies and the Minotaur than they really had to. This attitude concerned Race. He did his best to look as unthreatening as possible, but the mere fact that he was a harpy was enough to scare the prisoners. Then his eyes lighted on the man with the wooden leg sitting on the bed on the other cell. Race reasoned that if he could befriend that man somehow, then maybe the others would warn him. "What's your name?" Race asked, trying to make it sound as much like a request and not a demand as he possibly could. The elderly man looked up at Race, his eyes seeming somehow defiant. "I am Asquith," he replied. "Do you need a hand leaving the cell?" Race asked. "I will help him," the elderly woman almost spat. "If you really want to help him, you can look for my husband's crutch. They took it away from him before they put him in this cell. We don't know why. We didn't speak their language." "Probably to stop anyone from using it as a weapon," Asquith commented. "Probably," Race agreed. Race turned his attention to Gaggara and the Minotaur and asked, "Could you 2 search the place? You're looking for this elderly gentleman's crutch." "A long stick?" Orsa asked, "with a kind of weird handle?" "That'll be it," Race agreed. Orsa nodded and slid off the desk. "I think I saw it in the other room. I'll just go and get it." He headed through the door into the other half of the building. Race turned back to Asquith, fully with the intent of telling him that Orsa was fetching the crutch. He didn't get that far. Creeley was asking him a question. "So, what do we do now?" Without hesitation, Race offered the sword he was carrying to the soldier. "I need you, Galiki," and he pointed at the man in his mid-20s in the other cell. "Whatever his name is." "Tay," the man offered. "Tay?" Race asked. The man nodded. Race returned his attention to Creeley. "You, Galiki and Tay, to go door to door through the village. Tell the villagers to gather in front of the dome building. Warn them about us. Let them know we're on your side if you find an elf staying in the house with the villagers." Race hesitated for a moment and said, "Well, you know what has to be done." Creeley nodded his agreement. He accepted the sword. "Why us?" Galiki asked. He looked at the sword Race had just handed Creeley and licked his lips. "Because you 3 are the best suited. Or would you prefer your womenfolk to do your killing for you?" Race replied. "No," Galiki asked. "I mean, why aren't you doing this?" Race shook his head. "Tell me, If I knocked on your door, what would you do? I'd... Galiki started to say, and then he nodded. I understand. What about weapons? Tay asked. He stepped out from the cell. He seemed very nervous about being beyond the apparent safety of the cells and in such close proximity to the harpy. He wasn't the only one. The woman in her mid-20s had grabbed hold of him by the arm and was trying to pull him back inside the bars. There were weapons on the bodies by our municipal buildings, Ray said. There are others on the dead guards lying on the street. I'm sure you'll be able to find something. Are they going to come out of those cells? Gaggara asked. That's a good question, Race replied. He turned his attention to those who were still cowering as far as they could from him. Please, he said. I know I'm a harpy, as is my girlfriend, but Creeley here is a soldier of your duke, and he will vouch for me. If you aren't willing to trust me, then how can we expect any of the other villagers to trust me either? If we don't keep together, Creeley won't be able to lead all of us to my brother's hiding place, and the elves will have a field day collecting the stragglers. Your friends, your family could all die. Galiki looked at Reyes and nodded. It's hard to trust one of your ilk, let alone two in a Minotaur, but you've done nothing yet to make me think you intend me harm. Only the opposite. If things were different, I might be glad to call you friend. Then he emphasized the point. But you must understand it's hard for us to trust a creature such as yourself. I do understand, Reyes replied. I was brought up the same way. Might I make a suggestion? Tay offered. Reyes turned to Tay and said, Might I suggest that you and your two, how do I say, non-human friends wait here until the elves are dealt with. Then Creeley, Goliki, and maybe even Asquith could make an impassioned plea on your behalf and introduce you to the villagers. If you were introduced as friends, then maybe the villagers would be that much more accepting of you. You'll need to be disarmed, Goliki insisted, but people won't trust you if you're wielding huge weapons. Gaggara doesn't carry a weapon, and Creeley already has my sword. What about your Minotaur friend and that axe of his? Galiki asked. Reyes nodded. When he comes back with Asquith's leg, I'll talk to him about it.